Hello and welcome to Rights of the Free People, a program of the Rhode Island affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union. My name is Dan Weissman. I'm a volunteer at the ACLU and host of this program for more than 20 years. The topic this time of year is always the legislative preview. Rhode Island legislative session begins soon and will continue through the spring and will be eventful. We guarantee that. So we have with us two guests who have firsthand experience and knowledge about the state legislative session, can talk a little bit about accomplishments from last year, one of which we want to celebrate again, and then move on to what we're looking forward to for this year. 2019-2020. So my guests are Edith Ajello, House District 1, which consists of parts of the east side of Providence, parts of Smith Hill, and Water Place Park. Got that right?
Yes.
And Hannah Stern, who's the policy associate at the ACLU. So we have firsthand access to the brain trust up there in the office.
Agenda.
So I really think that we don't take enough time to applaud ourselves for accomplishments. And so I'm asking Edie to begin with highlights of the big victory last session.
Well, the big victory last session was passage of the Reproductive Privacy Act. That's legislation that was sponsored on the House side by Anastasia Williams. And it was improved through hard work on the part of a lot of people to make it do everything that the ACLU and the Woman Project and the League of Women Voters and a tremendous number of other advocacy organizations really wanted to see in legislation that would guarantee women's reproductive freedom in an age when we are frightened of what the U.S. Supreme Court may do to the Roe v. Wade and subsequent decisions regarding abortion rights. So with a lot of hard work, a huge number of volunteers advocating at the State House, afternoon and afternoon after afternoon and afternoon, week after week and month after month.
And not just 1 year.
Well, a number of years, but the winter spring of 2019 was unprecedented in the number of advocates that showed up day after day and made their feelings known and heard. We have some people to thank for the success. And I want to do a shout out to Erin Lynch Prada, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who did just amazing, unbelievable work in getting that bill through. But there were too many people to mention in terms of the names of all the people who were working on the scene, right there to be seen at the State House and behind the scenes. It was just magnificent work.
Offhand, do we know how many states have taken the same step?
New York State did it a bit before us. And maybe Illinois, or two others that I heard about at a Center for Reproductive Rights session in October in DC.
So only 3 at most. Yeah.
I'm not absolutely sure, but I know that there were people there from New York and Illinois, and I know that in Rhode Island we were hearing a lot about the evils of what the New York legislation did, and that what we heard was just simply not true in terms of what the New York legislation or ours did or does.
So unfortunately, there are still women's reproductive rights that need to be worked on.
Yes, and one of them is women's access to reproductive health care, specifically abortion coverage by insurance. A couple of years ago, someone asked me about whether they could purchase a rider to cover abortion, and that rider they'd be paying for themselves, even if the state was paying for their health insurance because they were a state employee. And what I found after asking a lot of people who at first assumed that abortion was covered, and then found that not only was it not covered, but that you couldn't even purchase a rider.
If you're
a state employee and your health insurance coverage is through the state, you cannot even pay out of your own pocket for a rider to cover abortion. So there is a move afoot, legislation being drafted, and my understanding is that the sponsors and folks behind the scenes on this are working with the ACLU on the language that would provide for insurance coverage for abortion for state employees with their state-provided health insurance and for Medicaid recipients.
Okay, so this will be a carry forward.
This would be a carry forward, and this would be an expansion. The legislation that we passed last spring, the Reproductive Privacy Act, really changes nothing in Rhode Island. All it did was put in law the provisions of the Roe decision and Casey and the others.
No payment mechanisms.
No payment.
Right.
No.
So, okay, we'll be looking at that piece of legislation.
Yes.
Hannah, what is the story with upcoming student-based legislation?
Yeah.
We're all kind of tripping over our words today.
We have a whole package of student and school-related legislation that we're either expecting to come up or expecting to support, or in some cases, not support. There's one example that I'll tell you about in just a second, but I would say one of the most critical pieces of legislation, and one that the ACLU in Rhode Island has been working on for a very long time, has to do with computer privacy for school-loaned computers to students. So a lot of schools now loan out either laptops or iPads to their students so that they're able to do school work on them, take them home to do homework. Some of them even encourage them to use them for personal use or for their family use. But unfortunately, there's no statutory or legislative guidance for the actual privacy protections on these computers, which could be a huge privacy violation for students, especially if they have them in their homes and if their families are using them. There was a really kind of disturbing example in Pennsylvania a few years ago where a school district was actually using the webcams on students' computers to spy on them remotely. And they were taking photos of the students in their bedrooms. There's a really distressing one of a student asleep in his bed. His computer was right next to his bed, and the school took a photo through his webcam of him sleeping. So although we haven't had a situation like that pop up with any of these computers in Rhode Island, it's certainly something that we think we should be very proactively approaching and making sure that no student becomes a victim of a school overreaching and overstepping the bounds of student privacy.
Why would schools want to go that direction?
That's hard to say. I think a lot of them, I would assume that the argument is that they want to make sure that students aren't doing anything inappropriate on these computers. But I don't really think that there's a decent explanation at all for why schools are using it to encroach on a student's personal and private and especially family space. I really don't think that there's any justifiable reason for a school to do that. But I would assume that that would be the reason that they would give, is that it's for security reasons.
And we don't know if it's happening in this state.
Yeah.
But it can.
Yeah, and we don't have anything that is definitively preventing it in either our statutes or in a lot of in a lot of the guidance that schools even give out to students regarding these loaned computers. So we did a study a few years ago that found that almost no schools included privacy protections in the guidelines that they are giving to students when they're also giving them these computers. So it's certainly a very distressing topic, and it's something that we hope will gain some traction this year, because it's really important to us on multiple fronts. It concerns student rights and it concerns privacy rights.
So are we also drafting kind of model policies or protections that school districts can then consider or adopt?
Yeah, I would say that the legislation provides a really comprehensive look at that. It has to do with what exactly what kind of privacy protections, exactly the circumstances under which a school can access a student's computer. So I would say that the statute would provide really comprehensive guidance to that.
Moving on to school trips, one of my favorites.
Us too. Yeah. So this is actually legislation that we are anticipating opposing. So in 2019, there was a very visible decision that the former Commissioner of Education in Rhode Island made that basically stated that schools cannot charge students for any field trips, which we firmly support and continue to, because the basic concept of educational equity and of public schooling is that no student or no family should feel like they have to put forward money for a student to participate in important extracurricular or academic activities. We've recently seen a few municipalities in Rhode Island push forward resolutions encouraging the General Assembly to pass legislation which would overturn this decision from the Commissioner of Education, which we would continue to oppose. Like I said before, it just flies in the face of the entire idea of a public education and of educational equity. There should be no reason that students or families of limited means should be expected to put up money for these really important experiences, and we just will continue to oppose it, and if any legislation comes up concerning that.
I just want to add, I find this so concerning that we've had years and years of the policy that kids couldn't be charged or their families couldn't be charged for a trip either during school hours or after school that a class was taking for enrichment purposes or for whatever purpose. If it was an educational function taken on by a school and a class, all the students who are eligible otherwise to go on that trip should be able to. And it shouldn't be a matter of whether their family can afford for them to go or their family can help them sell enough boxes of candy or whatever it is for them to go. And to put some kids in the position of not being able to go because they can't afford it or because their parents are making another decision with their discretionary money is putting kids in the same position as lunch shaming, which we heard so much about in the last year or so. Kids having their lunch taken away from them at the counter because their parents hadn't paid the bill for their lunch. And we've decided we're not going to do that to kids in school now. And these resolutions that have been sent by school committees, some in the state, to legislators like myself, suggest that if the student can't afford to pay, then the school will pay. But that puts the student in the position of applying for the help, having to ask, and having, being then perhaps pointed out, identified as someone who's living with less means. And it flies in the face, as you said, of our idea of public education and giving kids all the same shot when they're in public school.
So are we okay with the kind of approach that a trip is planned that's expensive and the school is able to pay X percent and the rest of the funding is not individually focused but group fundraising to make up the difference, and it's for everybody but not identified different amounts of subsidies for each kid. My school needs $15,000 so the kids could go to the Macy's march in the Macy's parade, the band. Let's raise $10,000 so everybody can go. That's okay, right?
I think it has to be carefully done so that no child, no student, or no family feels that there's this amount that they're responsible for. It really needs to be carefully done.
And not kid-based, not family-based, but trip-based.
No, not even maybe if it's the band going to march in the Thanksgiving Day parade, maybe it shouldn't be just band members that are raising the money. Maybe it should be school-wide, let's send the band, as opposed to the band members paying to go.
Car washes kind of things.
I think we would probably still express the same concern, which is that at its core, what you're doing is asking for parents and community members who are part of this public school to still be contributing funds for the students' experiences in their public education. And although I think that whether it's in the context of like group or crowdfunding or individual funding, I think it's still the same underpinning idea, which is that you're asking people who may not have those means to provide funds for really important educational experiences in many ways. And so I think that we would still probably have some concerns with that concept just because of the basic idea that you shouldn't have to pay for public school in order to have an enriching and full experience with it.
All right. I mean, it's certainly at its core understandable.
Yeah.
And the consequences can be severe for people who, on lots of levels. You know, like I can't afford for my kid to go, and the whole community is going to now think of me as somebody who needs a subsidy.
Yeah.
What about school discipline policies?
So
I've heard this before.
Yeah, it's a pretty it's a topic that comes up a lot, and for good reason. In 2016, the General Assembly passed legislation which limited the instances under which a student could be given an out-of-school suspension. It limited it to instances in which there's a direct harm, or if there's any threat. However, what we've found is in looking at discipline data since 2016 in the following school years, we're still seeing that there are massive discrepancies in the way that students are disciplined, especially for students of color and especially for students with disabilities or students who have IEPs. We see that they're actually disproportionately suspended compared to their populations in the schools. And many times the statistics are pretty horrifying, where you see that students with disabilities in certain districts are being suspended up to 10 times more than you would expect for their population. We've also seen that our youngest students, so students who are in 5th grade and under, they're being suspended more than they should. I think there's really no instances where a student in kindergarten should be removed from the classroom. It's hard to imagine a kindergartner being handed out a suspension for disorderly conduct, but it happens more than you think it would or should. And so we're going to be supporting legislation that will be introduced this year, which will further limit those instances where students can be suspended. One particular example of that is we want to limit the age where students can be suspended at. Like I said, there's really no circumstances under which a kindergartner should be removed from school. And especially if you're that young, and especially if you're being removed for really small issues like disrespect or things that are not putting anyone in harm or may just be normal behavioral issues that you would expect for a kindergarten age student. If you're pulling them out of class and disciplining them, you're throwing them into a pipeline which is really hard for them to get out of and really pushes them into the world of criminal justice before they're even in 1st grade. So we're going to be supporting legislation which further limits the instances under which a student can be given an out-of-school suspension.
And what about due process kind of protections? Would that be included?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I don't know if this legislation would immediately address that, but I mean, it certainly is in the grand concept of school discipline. That's a really critical thing to consider, but I'm not totally sure what specifically in the legislation.
Appeal rights.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
That's already a part of a lot of disciplinary processes. So that's actually something that when we receive calls from parents or who are concerned about a suspension that their student received, that's something that we encourage them to be aware of is their right to an appeal process. And that's something that we really do try to emphasize with all of the work we do around student rights, is that students can appeal their suspensions if they think that they're unjustly suspended. They can do that. But we also want to make sure that schools are not giving out these suspensions and not pulling students out of class in the first place, because that's where the damage really happens, is when they're losing them and when they're punishment. Even if an appeal helps and the suspension is overturned, there's still a significant amount of damage done.
Yeah. Which makes it hard for them to reintegrate when they get back to school.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. And time is moving along. So let's move away from schools and the driver's license issue.
Driver's license issue is really an issue of safety. We test people to make sure that they know the rules of the road and that they can manage a car safely before we allow them to have a driver's license. And by not allowing people who are living in Rhode Island but not citizens, without documentation of their right to be here, by not allowing them to drive, we can be making it difficult for them to take care of their families. We can be making it difficult for them to get to work, to get to a hospital or a doctor's appointment, to get kids to school. If they do then drive without a license, they're a danger because they're uninsured. And if if I'm involved in an accident with someone who is uninsured and without a license, it's on my insurance, which makes my insurance go up. More importantly, we're disadvantaging people with some idea of we're doing this because they're not documented, but we're really disadvantaging ourselves by not allowing these people to get a license.
And in many states, this is a problem, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, I don't hear that there's a movement out there to extend driver's license privileges to undocumented people in other states.
There are other states that have done it.
There are quite a few. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, so I don't want to give a figure, but it is over 10. So there are quite a few surprising. I mean, Utah has allowed these privileges. I think I know California and Oregon and Washington all allow those, extend the driver's license privileges to undocumented individuals, but I don't know the figure off the top of my head.
Is Vermont maybe one of the states too? I remember reading about Vermont and the effort there, and it came from dairy farmers.
Yeah.
Who needed workers for the dairy farms, and the cheese industry and the dairy industry is so important to
Vermont.
Vermont.
About Wisconsin too.
Yeah, but I found that fascinating. That it's a very clear economic advantage there, and it not probably quite so clear for us here, but.
Is there, we have just a couple of minutes, but one other question about this issue is, where does the resistance come from?
I'm not.
Police departments?
Police departments have pretty much been on board with it because, again, it's a safety. It's a safety issue.
There were the anti-immigrant groups, so they would
rile group.
I would probably just say it's xenophobia. I think that could.
Okay. Okay, that's good to know. And drug reclassification.
Reclassifying people who have been convicted of low-level drug possession, for instance, where they weren't dealing but had a relatively small amount of something particularly like marijuana, allowing people to be not considered guilty of a felony, but declassifying crimes down to the misdemeanor level, so that individuals, when they've done their time, can be eligible for state support with housing, can be eligible for higher education help, can be eligible for food stamps and things like that for their family. All those things that we do for people to help them get on their feet, we're not able to do because of some of the drug classification for people who have done things and been convicted of things that now would be just a civil situation, civil charge as opposed to a felony.
Got it. And the chances for that? I've heard that. I mean, I've heard that issue in previous years.
I think people come to the State House and they make a pretty good case. And
one would think.
yeah.
It's one of the Attorney General's pieces of legislation, so we have some institutional support, which is great.
Okay, that's encouraging.
Yeah.
And on that note, they're yelling in the control room that we're done. So we're looking forward to a session with some maybe more positives than losses this year, we can hope. Maybe we'll be celebrating.
Exactly. Hopefully.
Maybe we'll be celebrating again next year at this time, some accomplishments. So, Edith Ajello, District 1, House, thanks so much for being here. Hannah
My
Stern.
pleasure.
Hannah Stern from the office, the policy associate. Good to have you here.
Thank you.
Maybe I have to watch out for my job. And we'll see you next month. Thanks for tuning in, and our contact information is on your screen if any of these issues is of interest or concern. See you next time.